The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night that would forever change Officer Jason Reed's understanding of human evil. Static crackled through his radio as dispatch relayed the trembling voice of a delivery driver who had pulled over near the abandoned Griggs doll factory on the east side of town. "I can hear children crying inside that warehouse," the man whispered, his breath visible in the October air, every word dripping with genuine terror. Laughter, too, like a dozen kids playing some twisted game. "But there's nobody around for miles. The parking lot's empty, the gates are chained shut, but I swear on my life there are kids in there." Jason's blood ran cold as he gripped the steering wheel tighter, the headlights of his patrol car cutting through the darkness toward a building that had been sealed for over 2 decades. Beside him, Ace, his 5-year-old German shepherd partner, was already alert, ears pinned forward, sensing something profoundly wrong in the way only a dog could. The Griggs factory had been a local legend since Jason was a kid himself, a place where neighborhood children dared each other to get close before running away screaming at the sight of cracked porcelain doll heads staring through broken windows like the hollow eyes of the damned. But tonight wasn't about childhood fears or ghost stories told around campfires. As Jason's cruiser approached the rusted chain-link fence, Ace began whining, a low, desperate sound the veteran officer had never heard from his normally composed partner in their 3 years working together. The building loomed against the starless sky like a monument to forgotten nightmares, its brick walls covered in dead vines that looked like skeletal fingers reaching for heaven, while broken shutters hung at unnatural angles like dislocated limbs. Jason killed the engine and stepped out into the frigid October air, his breath forming ghostly clouds that dissipated into the darkness. The silence was absolute, except for the distant hum of highway traffic and the thundering of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears like war drums. Then he heard it too, faint but unmistakable, the ethereal sound of children's voices echoing from within the abandoned structure, carried on the wind like whispers from another world. Ace's hackles rose as he pressed against Jason's leg, every canine instinct screaming that they were about to uncover something that should have remained buried forever in the deepest corners of human depravity. Jason's flashlight beam swept across the dusty warehouse floor, illuminating thousands of dolls arranged on cracked wooden shelves like a grotesque audience waiting for a performance that should never begin. Baby dolls with missing eyes stared blindly into nothing. Antique porcelain figures with shattered cheeks bore wounds that looked disturbingly human, and oversized ventriloquist dummies displayed painted grins that seemed to follow their movement through the shadows with malevolent intelligence. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something else, something that made Jason's skin crawl, the unmistakable smell of fear that had soaked into the very foundations of this cursed place. Ace moved with predatory silence, his nose to the ground, every muscle tense as he led Jason deeper into the maze of forgotten toys until he stopped dead at a brick wall that looked newer, cleaner than the rest of the crumbling structure. The dog's growl vibrated through the stale air like a warning from the depths of hell as Jason tapped the wall with his knuckles, hearing the hollow echo that confirmed his worst suspicions. Behind this hastily constructed barrier lay secrets that someone had desperately tried to hide, secrets that had been festering in darkness for far too long. When the forensics team arrived an hour later with sledgehammers and crowbars, their faces grim with determination, they systematically dismantled the false wall, discovering layers of insulation, then plasterboard, then finally a black metal hatch bolted shut against whatever horrors lay beyond. The smell that escaped when they finally opened it wasn't the sweet stench of death that Jason had encountered in his 15 years of law enforcement, but something infinitely worse, the scent of human desperation, of sweat and fear and children who had been kept in darkness for reasons that defied comprehension. Jason peered into the narrow tunnel with his flashlight, seeing walls that were too small for any adult to navigate comfortably, designed specifically for children to crawl through like rats in some demented maze created by a mind twisted beyond redemption. Ace was already trying to squeeze himself into the opening when Jason grabbed his harness, every fiber of his being screaming that whatever lay ahead would change them both forever. But it was while reviewing the body camera footage later that night, in the sterile fluorescent lighting of the police station, that Jason's world truly shattered into a million irreparable pieces. At the 42-minute mark, just as he passed a row of hanging marionettes, one of the dolls turned its head with deliberate, calculated movement that defied every law of physics and sanity. Jason froze the frame and zoomed in with trembling hands, his breath catching in his throat as the truth became undeniable. The eyes staring back at him weren't glass or plastic or any manufactured material. They were human eyes, blinking, with the terror of a child who had been watching, waiting, praying for someone to find them. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel K9 Loyal Souls, where we uncover true stories of animals' bravery you won't believe until you see it, and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching us from? In the world of law enforcement, there exists a partnership forged not through words or contracts, but through an unbreakable bond of trust, loyalty, and instinct that transcends human understanding and challenges everything we think we know about justice and the pursuit of truth in modern society, where evil hides behind facades of normalcy. K9 units represent the pinnacle of this collaboration, where highly trained police dogs work alongside their human handlers to solve crimes that would otherwise remain buried in darkness forever, their combined abilities creating a force that criminals fear and victims pray will find them before hope completely dies and despair takes hold of their broken spirits. These four-legged heroes possess abilities that no technology can replicate, no computer algorithm can match, no artificial intelligence can simulate or understand completely, senses so acute they can detect the faintest traces of evidence, the subtlest changes in human behavior, and dangers that lurk beyond our perception in the shadows, where evil takes root and grows like a cancer spreading through society. But sometimes, these remarkable animals lead their handlers into territories that challenge everything we thought we knew about the depths of human cruelty and the unimaginable lengths to which some will go to satisfy their twisted desires for power, control, and the systematic destruction of innocence itself. This is the story of Officer Jason Reed and his German Shepherd partner Ace, whose routine patrol on a cold October night in Cascade County would uncover a network of evil so sophisticated, so deeply embedded in the shadows of society, that it would shake the very foundations of their small community and expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond the borders of their jurisdiction into the darkest corners of human trafficking, organized crime, and systematic abuse that defies all comprehension. What began as a simple welfare check at an abandoned doll factory would evolve into a multi-state investigation involving federal agencies, revealing a systematic operation designed to strip children of their humanity and transform them into living dolls for purposes too horrific to comprehend or speak aloud in civilized society. The Griggs doll factory had stood empty since the late 1990s, a monument to forgotten childhood dreams that had slowly transformed into a nightmare that parents used to frighten misbehaving children into compliance with bedtime stories that were far more real than anyone dared to imagine or acknowledge. But on this particular night, the building would surrender its secrets to a team that refused to accept that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, some doors were meant to stay locked, and some evils were too powerful to confront head-on without devastating consequences. Jason Reed had served the Cascade Police Department for 15 years, working his way up from patrol officer to K9 handler, through dedication, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to justice that had cost him relationships, sleep, and pieces of his soul. But nothing in his extensive training, countless hours of preparation, or years of experience dealing with humanity's worst impulses had prepared him for what he and Ace would discover, hidden beneath layers of deception, false walls, and carefully constructed lies that had been maintained for decades by people who understood that the greatest monsters are those who hide in plain sight, wearing masks of respectability while committing atrocities that would haunt the dreams of anyone who dared to look too closely into the abyss of human depravity and systematic evil that thrives in shadows and silence. The radio crackled to life at exactly 11:47 p.m., cutting through the monotonous hum of Jason's patrol car heater and the rhythmic sound of windshield wipers fighting against the October drizzle that had been falling steadily for the past 3 hours, like tears from a sorrowful sky. Static filled the air for a moment before dispatch broke through with a call that would haunt Jason for the rest of his career and change everything he thought he knew about the nature of evil in his quiet community. The voice belonged to Marcus Chen, a delivery driver for Northwest Logistics, who had been making late-night runs along the industrial corridor when something made him pull over near the abandoned Griggs doll factory, his hands shaking as he gripped his cell phone with white knuckles. His voice trembled with genuine terror as he spoke to the emergency operator, each word punctuated by the sound of his labored breathing and the distant rumble of 18-wheelers passing on the nearby interstate like mechanical ghosts in the night. "I can hear children crying inside that warehouse," Marcus whispered, his breath visible in puffs of vapor as he stood beside his delivery truck, headlights illuminating the rusted chain-link fence that surrounded the property like a barrier between the living world and something far more sinister. Not just one or two kids, but like a whole group of them, laughing and playing some kind of game. But there's nobody around for miles, and the place has been empty for decades, boarded up and forgotten by everyone except the kids, who dare each other to get close. Jason felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. His 15 years of experience in law enforcement telling him that children didn't play games in abandoned buildings at midnight unless something was terribly, horrifically wrong. Beside him in the passenger seat, Ace lifted his massive head from where he had been resting peacefully, ears immediately pricking forward, with an alertness that Jason had learned to trust implicitly over their 3 years as partners. The German shepherd's nostrils flared, as if he could somehow smell danger through the radio waves, his amber eyes reflecting the green glow of the dashboard lights as he stared intently at Jason with an expression that seemed to say he understood the gravity of what they were about to face. Dispatch confirmed the address, and Jason felt his stomach drop as he realized they were heading to a place that had been the subject of local legends and ghost stories for as long as he could remember, a building where neighborhood kids dared each other to get close enough to touch the front door before running away screaming at the sight of broken doll heads, staring at them through shattered windows like the hollow eyes of the damned. The Griggs doll factory had been shuttered since 1998, its gates chained and its windows boarded up after the company went bankrupt following a series of unfortunate events that had driven away customers and investors alike, leaving behind only memories and rumors of what had once been a thriving business. But as Jason turned onto Industrial Boulevard and saw the building looming in the distance like a monument to forgotten nightmares, he noticed something that made his heart race with anticipation and dread. There were lights flickering in some of the upper windows, faint and intermittent, as if someone was moving around inside with a flashlight or candle, and the sound that Marcus had described was growing louder as they approached, the unmistakable sound of children's voices carrying on the wind like whispers from another world, where innocence had been twisted into something unrecognizable and terrifying. Ace began whining softly, a sound Jason had never heard from his normally composed partner, and as they pulled up to the front gate with headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights probing the depths of human depravity, both man and dog knew they were about to step into a nightmare that would test every skill they possessed, challenge everything they thought they knew about the limits of human evil, and forever change their understanding of how far some people will go to satisfy their most twisted desires while hiding behind facades of normalcy and respectability. The rusted padlock gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the night like a gunshot, the sound seeming to reverberate off the brick walls of the factory and bounce back at them with an almost accusatory tone. Jason pushed through the chain-link gate, its hinges screaming in protest after decades of neglect, while Ace pressed close to his leg, every muscle in the German shepherd's body coiled tight with tension. The beam of Jason's heavy-duty flashlight cut through the darkness ahead of them, illuminating a pathway littered with broken glass, discarded beer, bottles, and the skeletal remains of what had once been landscaping around the building's entrance. The air was thick with the smell of decay, rust, and something else that Jason couldn't quite identify, but that made his skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. As they approached the main entrance, Jason noticed that one of the heavy steel doors was slightly ajar, hanging open just enough to create a sliver of impenetrable darkness that seemed to swallow his flashlight beam like a hungry mouth, waiting to devour whatever light dared to enter its domain. Ace stopped abruptly at the threshold, his hackles rising in a display of pure animal instinct that had been honed by millions of years of evolution to recognize danger, even when the human mind couldn't process what was wrong. The dog's nose twitched frantically as he sampled the air, and a low growl began to rumble in his chest, a sound so primal and filled with warning that it made Jason's hand instinctively move to his service. Weapon. The moment they stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop by at least 10 degrees, and their breath began to mist in the stale air that carried the unmistakable scent of fear, desperation, and something far more sinister that human beings were never meant to encounter. Jason's flashlight swept across the interior of the warehouse, revealing a sight that would be burned into his memory for the rest of his life. Thousands upon thousands of dolls arranged on wooden shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, their glassy eyes reflecting his light like tiny mirrors that captured and held fragments of his soul. Baby dolls with cherubic faces and missing limbs, antique porcelain figures with cracks running down their cheeks like tears of blood, ventriloquist dummies with painted smiles that seemed to grow wider in the shifting shadows, and mannequins posed in unnatural positions that suggested they had been arranged by someone with a deeply disturbed understanding of human anatomy. The sound of children's laughter that had drawn them here was louder now, echoing through the cavernous space with an ethereal quality that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the very walls had absorbed the voices of countless children over the years, and were now releasing them back into the world, like trapped spirits, finally given permission to speak. Ace moved forward with the careful precision of a trained search and rescue dog, his nose to the ground as he followed a scent trail that only he could detect, weaving between piles of broken toys and discarded doll parts with the focused intensity of a predator stalking its prey. Jason followed close behind, his heart hammering against his ribs as he tried to process the sheer scale of what they had discovered, wondering how many children had passed through this place and what had happened to them in the darkness that no amount of artificial light could ever truly penetrate. The laughter grew louder. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, joined now by what sounded like whispered conversations and the faint sound of someone crying, and Jason realized with growing horror that these weren't the echoes of long-dead voices, but the very real sounds of living children who were somewhere in this labyrinth of broken dreams and shattered innocence, waiting for someone to find them before it was too late. Ace's behavior changed dramatically as they ventured deeper into the warehouse, his normally steady gait becoming more cautious and deliberate, as if he was navigating through a minefield where one wrong step could trigger consequences too terrible to imagine. The German shepherd's ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds that human ears couldn't detect, his head turning left and right with the mechanical precision of a radar dish, scanning for signals from another world. Jason had worked with enough canine units over the years to recognize the difference between a dog following a simple scent trail and one that had detected something that challenged every instinct bred into his DNA over thousands of years of domestication. This was different. This was primal fear, mixed with professional duty, and it was unlike anything Jason had ever witnessed in his 3 years partnering with Ace. The dog suddenly stopped at what appeared to be a solid brick wall near the back of the warehouse, a section that looked newer and cleaner than the rest of the structure, as if it had been hastily constructed to hide something that was never meant to be found. Ace's nose worked frantically along the base of the wall, his nostrils flaring as he processed information that only a canine brain could interpret, and then he did something that made Jason's blood run cold. He sat down and barked once, sharp and urgent, the universal canine signal that meant he had found what they were looking for, but there was nothing there. Just a wall of red brick and old mortar that looked like it had been standing for decades, weathered by time and neglect into something that appeared completely innocent to human eyes. Jason approached slowly, his flashlight beam dancing across the bricks as he searched for any sign of what had triggered Ace's alert, and that's when he noticed the subtle differences that only someone with years of investigative experience would catch. The mortar between these bricks was slightly different in color. The bricks themselves were a shade darker than the rest of the wall, and when he tapped them with his knuckles, the sound was wrong, hollow in a way that suggested empty space beyond rather than solid masonry. Ace began to pace back and forth in front of the wall, his agitation growing more pronounced by the minute, and when Jason knelt down to examine the base more closely, he discovered something that made his hands tremble. Fresh scratches in the concrete floor, as if something heavy had been dragged across it recently, and traces of what looked like white powder that could have been plaster dust or something far more sinister. The children's voices that had led them here seemed to be coming from beyond this wall, muffled but unmistakably real, and Jason realized with growing certainty that they had stumbled upon something that was actively being used for purposes that no civilized society would tolerate. He pulled out his radio to call for backup, but the thick walls of the warehouse seemed to interfere with the signal, leaving him with nothing but static, and the growing realization that they were completely alone in a place where horrible things had been happening for far longer than anyone had suspected. Ace's whining grew more insistent, and he began pawing at the wall with a desperation that suggested he could sense the presence of children in distress somewhere beyond the barrier, his training and instincts combining to create an urgency that communicated itself to Jason on a level deeper than words. The sound of crying was clearer now, coming from what seemed to be directly behind the wall, and Jason made the decision that would change everything. He was going to find a way through that barrier, even if it meant tearing down the entire structure brick by brick with his bare hands, because somewhere in the darkness beyond, children were waiting for someone to save them from a nightmare that had been carefully hidden from the outside world for reasons that he was only beginning to understand. The forensics team arrived exactly 1 hour and 17 minutes after Jason's urgent radio call finally broke through the interference, their headlights cutting through the October darkness like searchlights probing the depths of a crime scene that would haunt every officer present for the rest of their careers. Detective Sarah Martinez led the team, a veteran investigator whose 20-year career had exposed her to humanity's darkest impulses, but even she stopped short when she saw the expression on Jason's face as he met them at the warehouse entrance. His skin was pale, his hands were shaking slightly, and Ace remained glued to his side with an alertness that suggested the dog knew they had uncovered something that transcended normal criminal activity and entered territory that challenged the very foundations of civilized society. The team worked methodically to dismantle the false wall that Ace had detected, using sledgehammers and crowbars to break through layers of hastily constructed brick and mortar that had been designed to hide secrets too terrible for daylight. Behind the initial barrier, they discovered insulation that had been stuffed into every available space, then sheets of plasterboard that had been painted to match the surrounding walls, and finally a black metal hatch that had been bolted shut with industrial-grade hardware that spoke of someone's desperate need to keep whatever lay beyond permanently sealed from the outside world. When they finally opened that hatch, the smell that escaped was unlike anything any of them had encountered in their professional lives, not the sweet stench of death that homicide detectives learn to recognize, but something far more disturbing, the scent of living human beings who had been kept in conditions that defied every basic principle of human dignity and compassion. The tunnel beyond the hatch was narrow and cramped, clearly designed for children to navigate rather than adults, and Jason realized with growing horror that they had discovered not just a hiding place, but an entire infrastructure that had been carefully planned and constructed over months or possibly years by someone with intimate knowledge of how to break the human spirit systematically and methodically. Detective Martinez insisted on going first, her smaller frame allowing her to squeeze through the opening more easily than the larger officers, and her voice echoed back through the tunnel with a tremor that spoke of discoveries that would require years of therapy to process fully. What she found in the chamber beyond the tunnel would become the centerpiece of a federal investigation that would span multiple states and involve agencies from the FBI to Homeland Security, because what had been hidden beneath the Griggs doll factory was not just evidence of individual criminal activity, but proof of an organized network that had been operating with sophisticated planning and coordination for longer than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The children they discovered that night were alive, but had been subjected to psychological conditioning that had stripped away their ability to speak, to cry, to react to outside stimuli in ways that normal human beings took for granted, and the dolls that surrounded them were not toys but props in a systematic program designed to transform living children into objects that could be displayed, arranged, and controlled like inanimate possessions. Jason watched through the opening as Detective Martinez carefully documented each child's condition, her professional composure cracking slightly as she realized the full scope of what they had uncovered, and he knew that this was only the beginning of an investigation that would reveal horrors beyond anything his small-town police department had ever been trained to handle, because whoever had created this nightmare had resources, connections, and a level of organizational sophistication that suggested they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a lone predator operating in isolation. Back at the police station at 3:30 in the morning, Jason sat alone in the video review room with nothing but a cup of cold coffee and the body camera footage that would either validate his sanity or confirm that the stress of what they had discovered was beginning to affect his perception of reality. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the persistent hum of electricity fighting against the darkness, casting harsh shadows. Across the walls as he scrubbed through the digital recording frame by frame, searching for something that his conscious mind had registered, but his rational brain refused to accept. Ace lay on the floor beside his chair, the German shepherd's breathing finally returning to normal after hours of hypervigilance, but his ears still twitched at every sound from the hallway outside, as if he expected danger to follow them even into the supposed safety of the police station. The footage from their initial sweep of the warehouse played back in stark black and white, the infrared camera capturing details that human eyes had missed in the confusion and adrenaline of the moment, and Jason fast-forwarded through the early sections where they had first entered the building and encountered the vast collection of dolls that now seemed like a grotesque preview of the horrors they would discover deeper in the structure. At the 41-minute mark, he slowed the playback to normal speed, watching himself move past a row of hanging marionettes whose strings had been cut and left to dangle like the severed nerves of broken dreams, and that's when he saw it. Movement that defied every law of physics and rational explanation that his 15 years in law enforcement had taught him to rely upon. One of the dolls, a porcelain figure dressed in a white lace dress with dark curly hair, turned its head to follow his movement across the screen, the motion deliberate and calculated rather than the random swaying that might be caused by air currents or vibrations from their footsteps. Jason's finger hovered over the pause button as he watched the impossible happen in high-definition clarity, his heart rate accelerating as he realized that what he was seeing challenged everything. He thought he knew about the nature of reality and the limits of human cruelty. He rewound the footage and watched again, this time zooming in on the doll's face, and what he saw there would haunt his dreams for months to come. Eyes that were not the glassy orbs of manufactured toys, but the living, blinking, terrified eyes of a real child who had been posed and dressed and positioned among the fake dolls like a grotesque game of camouflage designed to hide victims in plain sight. The child's mouth had been covered with something that prevented speech, but the eyes conveyed a desperation and intelligence that screamed for help in a language that transcended words, and Jason realized that they had been walking through a gallery of living children who had been transformed into displays for purposes too horrific for his mind to fully process. He zoomed in further, enhancing the image until he could see the subtle rise and fall of the child's chest, the tiny movements of facial muscles that indicated consciousness and awareness, and the tear tracks that had dried on cheeks that should have been rosy with health and happiness rather than pale with the exhaustion of prolonged terror. This was not just a trafficking operation or even a typical case of child abuse. This was something that required a level of psychological sophistication and systematic planning that suggested they were dealing with individuals who had studied human behavior and conditioning with the cold precision of scientists conducting experiments on laboratory subjects. Jason saved the enhanced image to a secure drive and made copies for the federal investigators who would arrive in the morning, knowing that this single frame of video would become crucial evidence in a case that would redefine how law enforcement agencies across the country understood the evolving nature of crimes against children and the technological methods that predators were using to hide their activities from detection by traditional investigative techniques. The investigation exploded beyond the confines of Cascade County within 48 hours of the initial discovery, as federal agents arrived with specialized equipment and expertise. That transformed the local police station into a command center for what would become one of the largest child trafficking investigations in Pacific Northwest history. Agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit brought with her a team of forensic specialists, behavioral analysts, and technical experts who began the painstaking process of unraveling a network that had been operating with sophisticated coordination across multiple jurisdictions for what appeared to be several years. The evidence they uncovered in the hidden chambers beneath the Griggs factory painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far beyond the isolated actions of a single predator, revealing instead an organized operation that involved multiple locations, coordinated supply chains, and a customer base that spanned several states and possibly extended into international markets for what could only be described as human merchandise. Detective Martinez worked closely with Agent Torres to map the connections between the Griggs factory and similar operations that had been discovered in Oregon, Idaho, and Northern California, finding disturbing patterns in the methods used to acquire, condition, and transport children who had been selected for their vulnerability and isolation from supportive family networks. The financial records they recovered from a hidden office space in the warehouse revealed a complex web of shell companies and fake charitable organizations that had been used to legitimize the movement of funds and provide cover for activities that generated millions of dollars in revenue for individuals whose identities remained hidden behind layers of legal protection and technological obfuscation. What emerged from their analysis was a business model that treated children as renewable resources to be harvested, processed, and distributed to customers who paid premium prices for what they called bespoke experiences, with victims who had been conditioned to remain silent and compliant regardless of what was done to them. The psychological profiles developed by FBI behavioral analysts suggested that the operation was being run by individuals with extensive knowledge of child development, behavioral conditioning, and trauma response, indicating that they were dealing with predators who had either professional training in psychology or access to experts who could provide the technical knowledge necessary to break children's spirits systematically and irreversibly. Jason found himself working longer hours than he had ever worked in his career, poring over evidence with Ace at his side as they tried to piece together the scope of what they had uncovered and identify other locations where similar operations might be active. The breakthrough came when forensic accountants traced a series of property purchases to a network of abandoned buildings across the Pacific Northwest, all acquired through the same legal entities that had been used to finance the Griggs factory renovations, and satellite imagery revealed suspicious activity at several locations that warranted immediate investigation by coordinated task forces. Agent Torres briefed Jason on the preliminary findings from other sites, describing warehouses in Portland that had been converted into sophisticated conditioning facilities, abandoned schools in rural Idaho that showed signs of recent renovation and occupancy, and a defunct toy factory in Northern California where thermal imaging had detected heat signatures consistent with human occupation in areas that were supposed to be empty and sealed. The scale of what they were confronting began to sink in as Jason realized that the children they had rescued from the Griggs factory represented only a small fraction of the victims who had been processed through this network, and the evidence suggested that many more children were still being held at locations they had not yet identified, waiting for rescue teams. That might arrive too late to prevent permanent psychological damage or worse. The investigation was expanding faster than local resources could handle, requiring coordination between multiple federal agencies and law enforcement jurisdictions that had never worked together on cases of this complexity and scope. But Jason knew that every hour of delay meant more children were suffering in conditions designed to destroy their humanity and transform them into products for consumption by individuals whose appetites for domination and control had led them far beyond the boundaries of anything resembling normal human behavior. 3 days after the initial discovery, Jason found himself standing in the parking lot of what had once been St. Mary's Elementary School, a building that had been abandoned for over a decade, but now showed signs of recent activity that made his stomach churn with anticipation and dread. The FBI task force had identified this location through financial records linking it to the same shell companies that had operated the Griggs factory, and thermal imaging from surveillance aircraft had detected heat signatures in the basement areas that suggested human occupation despite the building's supposed vacancy. Ace sat beside Jason's patrol car, his ears alert and his body language indicating that he was detecting scents and sounds that confirmed their worst suspicions about what they might find inside the crumbling brick structure that had once echoed with the laughter of innocent children attending classes and playing games during recess. Agent Torres briefed the assembled team of federal agents, local police, and specialized rescue personnel on the intelligence they had gathered about the building's layout and the security measures that might have been installed to prevent unauthorized access or to alert the occupants if law enforcement approached the property. The school's original blueprints showed a basement level that had been used for storage and mechanical equipment, but recent renovations appeared to have created additional spaces that were not reflected in any official building permits or inspection records, suggesting that whoever was using the facility had gone to considerable lengths to hide their activities from local authorities and building inspectors. Jason checked his equipment one final time, ensuring that his body camera was functioning properly and that Ace's tracking vest was securely fastened, knowing that whatever they discovered inside this building would become crucial evidence in a case that was already attracting national attention from media outlets and advocacy groups demanding justice for the victims who had been rescued from similar facilities across the region. The entry team moved with practiced precision, using specialized tools to breach the main doors without triggering any alarm systems that might alert the occupants to their presence, and Jason followed close behind with Ace, leading the way through corridors lined with abandoned classrooms where dusty chalkboards still displayed lessons that had been interrupted years ago when budget cuts forced the school's closure. The basement access was hidden behind a false wall in what had been the school's library, disguised so skillfully that it would have been impossible to detect without the intelligence provided by financial investigations and architectural analysis conducted by federal specialists who had experience with similar concealment techniques used by trafficking networks. As they descended into the hidden basement levels, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the air became thick with the same chemical smell that Jason had encountered at the Griggs factory, a combination of cleaning solvents and something else that spoke of systematic attempts to eliminate evidence and maintain sterile conditions for activities that required clinical precision and emotional detachment from the suffering they caused. Ace's behavior became increasingly agitated as they moved deeper into the facility, his nose working frantically to process scents that triggered every protective instinct bred into his genetic code, and Jason knew that they were approaching another chamber of horrors where children had been subjected to conditioning techniques designed to strip away their humanity and transform them into commodities for individuals whose appetites for control and domination had led them far beyond the boundaries of civilized behavior. The sound of children's voices reached them before they saw the source, muffled whispers and quiet sobbing that seemed to come from behind another concealed door that had been constructed with the same attention to detail and sophisticated engineering that had characterized the Griggs factory, indicating that they were dealing with an organization that had access to professional contractors and specialized knowledge about how to create facilities that could remain hidden from conventional law enforcement detection methods. The hidden door opened to reveal a sight that would haunt every member of the rescue team for the rest of their lives. A sterile white room lined with glass observation windows where 12 children sat motionless in chairs that had been specifically designed to maintain posture and prevent movement, their eyes vacant and unblinking as they stared straight ahead with the empty expressions of individuals whose spirits had been systematically broken through months or years of psychological conditioning. Jason's hands trembled as he took in the clinical precision of the setup, recognizing that they had discovered not just another holding facility, but what appeared to be a research laboratory where human beings were being studied and modified like experimental subjects in a program that combined the worst aspects of human trafficking with the cold methodology of behavioral science, conducted without ethical oversight or moral constraints. Agent Torres immediately called for additional medical personnel and child psychologists, while Jason and Ace moved carefully through the room, documenting each child's condition and searching for any signs of immediate medical distress that would require emergency intervention before they could be safely transported to hospitals equipped to handle victims of extreme psychological trauma. The children ranged in age from approximately 6 to 12 years old, and all of them had been dressed in identical white clothing that gave them the appearance of patients in a psychiatric facility or subjects in a clinical trial, their hair cut to uniform lengths and their faces bearing the pale complexion of individuals who had been kept indoors for extended periods without access to natural sunlight or normal social interaction. None of the children responded to verbal commands or showed any recognition of the rescue team's presence, their conditioning apparently so complete that they had lost the ability to react to external stimuli in ways that normal human beings would consider natural or appropriate, and Jason realized that recovering from this level of psychological damage would require years of specialized therapy and might never be completely successful in restoring their capacity for normal emotional expression and social interaction. Behind the observation windows, the team discovered monitoring equipment that had been used to record the children's responses to various stimuli and conditioning protocols, with detailed logs that documented the progression of their psychological breakdown and the methods that had been most effective in achieving the desired level of compliance and emotional detachment from their surroundings. The technical sophistication of the operation was staggering, indicating that whoever was responsible had access to advanced psychological research and monitoring technology that would typically be found only in university research facilities or government laboratories conducting studies on human behavior and cognitive development. Agent Torres found computers containing encrypted files that would require weeks of analysis by federal cybercrime specialists to decode, but the preliminary examination revealed references to other facilities and a network of clients who had paid substantial amounts of money for access to children who had been conditioned according to specific behavioral profiles and psychological characteristics. The rescue operation required careful coordination between medical personnel and law enforcement officers, as the children's extreme conditioning made them unresponsive to normal rescue protocols and potentially dangerous to themselves if moved too quickly or exposed to stimuli that might trigger panic responses or self-destructive behaviors that had been programmed into their psychological conditioning. Jason watched as specially trained child psychologists worked with infinite patience to establish basic communication with each victim, using techniques designed to bypass the conditioning and reach whatever remained of their original personalities beneath the layers of programmed responses and learned helplessness that had been systematically installed over months of careful manipulation and control. The evidence they collected from this facility would prove that the network they were investigating had evolved far beyond simple trafficking into something that resembled a systematic program of human experimentation conducted for both commercial and research purposes, with implications that extended into areas of behavioral science and psychological manipulation that challenged everything law enforcement agencies thought they knew about the capabilities and objectives of modern criminal organizations that specialized in crimes against children. 6 weeks into the investigation, Jason sat in a secure conference room at the FBI field office in Seattle, surrounded by evidence boards covered with photographs, maps, financial records, and psychological profiles that painted a picture of criminal sophistication that challenged everything he thought he knew about the limits of human depravity and organizational capability. Agent Torres had flown in specialists from Quantico and the Department of Homeland Security to analyze the data they had collected from multiple raid sites, and what emerged from their analysis was not just evidence of a trafficking network, but proof of something far more sinister that combined commercial exploitation with systematic research into human behavioral modification techniques that had potential applications extending well beyond the criminal marketplace. The decrypted computer files from the St. Mary's facility revealed correspondence with individuals who appeared to be academics and researchers affiliated with universities and private research institutions, discussing methodologies for psychological conditioning and behavioral modification that were being tested on the children who had been acquired through the trafficking network. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, a forensic psychologist brought in to analyze the conditioning protocols, explained to the assembled investigators that what they had discovered represented a convergence of criminal activity with legitimate but unethical research into human consciousness and behavior control, suggesting that some of the victims had been used as test subjects in experiments designed to develop techniques for systematic mind control and personality modification. The financial records showed payments from sources that included not only individual clients seeking access to conditioned children, but also research grants and consulting fees from organizations that appeared to be studying the effectiveness of various psychological manipulation techniques for potential applications in areas ranging from military training to corporate human resources management. Jason struggled to process the implications of what they were learning, realizing that the children they had rescued were not just victims of trafficking, but had been subjected to experimental procedures that might have caused permanent damage to their cognitive and emotional development in ways that current medical science did not fully understand or know how to treat effectively. The network they were investigating had apparently recruited individuals with advanced degrees in psychology, neuroscience, and behavioral research, creating a hybrid organization that combined criminal enterprise with scientific methodology to produce results that could be sold both to traditional trafficking clients and to researchers interested in advancing the state of knowledge about human psychological manipulation and control. Agent Torres briefed Jason on similar cases that had been identified in other countries, particularly in Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, where trafficking networks had evolved to include research components that generated additional revenue by selling data and methodologies to organizations interested in developing more sophisticated techniques for human behavioral modification and social control. The scope of what they had uncovered was beginning to attract attention from national security agencies concerned about the potential military and intelligence applications of the research that had been conducted using the trafficked children as unwilling test subjects. And Jason realized that their investigation was expanding into areas that went far beyond traditional law enforcement and into realms of international security and strategic intelligence that required resources and expertise that local police departments were never designed to handle. The psychological evaluation reports on the rescued children revealed damage that was more extensive and systematic than anything previously documented in trafficking cases, with evidence of conditioning, techniques that had been refined through trial and error over multiple generations of victims to achieve levels of behavioral control that approached the theoretical limits of what psychological science considered possible. Dr. Hawthorne explained that recovery for these children would require the development of new therapeutic approaches specifically designed to counteract conditioning techniques that had been informed by cutting-edge research in neuroscience and cognitive psychology, and that some of the damage might be irreversible depending on how long the victims had been subjected to the experimental protocols. Jason looked at the evidence boards and realized that what had started as a routine welfare check at an abandoned factory had led them into a world where the boundaries between criminal activity and scientific research had been deliberately blurred by individuals who viewed human beings as laboratory subjects and commercial products to be optimized for specific purposes, without regard for ethical constraints or human dignity. The breakthrough came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening when digital forensics specialists finally cracked the encryption on a server they had seized from the St. Mary's facility, revealing real-time communications between network operators and a client list that read like a who's who of individuals with wealth, political connections, and access to resources that had allowed this operation to continue undetected for years, while expanding its reach across multiple states and international borders. Agent Torres called Jason at home with news that would require him to leave Ace with a neighbor and drive immediately to a safe house where they were preparing to arrest Dr. Richard Julian, the man whose initials had appeared on documents throughout their investigation and who had finally been identified as the architect of the entire network through digital breadcrumbs that led back to academic research he had published years earlier on behavioral modification and psychological conditioning techniques. Jason arrived at the safe house to find a coordinated operation involving multiple federal agencies, with surveillance teams confirming that Dr. Julian was currently at a private residence in the affluent Laurelhurst neighborhood of Portland, apparently unaware that his network had been compromised and that rescue teams were simultaneously raiding facilities in 4 different states based on intelligence gathered from the encrypted communications. The arrest warrant described charges that included human trafficking, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, conducting illegal human experimentation, and operating a criminal enterprise that had generated millions of dollars in revenue through the systematic abuse and exploitation of children who had been acquired through a sophisticated recruitment network that targeted vulnerable families and runaway youth who were unlikely to be missed by authorities or advocacy groups. Dr. Julian's background revealed a brilliant but deeply disturbed individual who had been dismissed from his university position years earlier following allegations of unethical research practices, after which he had apparently decided to continue his work outside the constraints of academic oversight and ethical review boards that had previously limited his ability to conduct the type of experiments that his theories required for validation and refinement. The surveillance footage from his residence showed a man in his late 50s who appeared calm and confident, continuing his daily routines without any apparent awareness that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse around him as federal agents moved into position to execute arrest warrants and search the property for evidence that would connect him directly to the facilities where children had been subjected to psychological conditioning that represented the practical application of his theoretical research. When The arrest team finally moved. Dr. Julian offered no resistance, but displayed an unsettling composure that suggested he viewed his capture as merely another data point in an ongoing experiment, rather than the end of a criminal enterprise that had destroyed the lives of dozens of children across multiple states. His first words to Agent Torres were not a request for an attorney or a denial of wrongdoing, but a clinical observation about the efficiency of the law enforcement response and a comment that the entire investigation would provide valuable insights into the effectiveness of network security protocols and operational security measures that could be applied to future research projects. Jason watched through one-way glass as federal interrogators attempted to extract information about other facilities and potential victims, but Dr. Julian approached each question with the detached analytical perspective of a researcher discussing experimental methodology rather than someone facing multiple life sentences for crimes against children that represented some of the most horrific examples of systematic abuse that federal prosecutors had ever encountered. The man's psychological profile suggested a complete disconnection from normal human empathy, combined with an intellectual curiosity about human behavior that had evolved into something resembling scientific sadism, where the suffering of others was viewed as necessary data collection in service of advancing knowledge about the limits of psychological manipulation and behavioral control. As the hours passed, it became clear that Dr. Julian viewed himself not as a criminal, but as a misunderstood pioneer whose research into human consciousness and behavioral modification was ahead of its time, and constrained only by society's arbitrary ethical limitations that prevented the advancement of scientific knowledge through necessary experimentation on human subjects who represented valuable research opportunities rather than individuals deserving of protection and dignity. 6 months after the arrests and convictions that dismantled what federal prosecutors called the largest and most sophisticated child trafficking network ever discovered in the Pacific Northwest, Jason found himself standing in the lobby of the Seattle Children's Hospital, watching through observation windows as some of the rescued children participated in experimental therapy programs designed specifically to counteract the psychological conditioning they had endured during their captivity. Dr. Sarah Chen, the leading specialist in trauma recovery who had been brought in to develop treatment protocols for the victims, explained to Jason that the recovery process was unlike anything previously documented in medical literature, requiring the development of entirely new therapeutic approaches that combined traditional trauma therapy with techniques designed to rebuild cognitive and emotional functions that had been systematically dismantled through months or years of psychological manipulation. The success stories were miraculous but heartbreaking, as children slowly began to rediscover their ability to speak, to express emotions, to form relationships with caregivers and therapists who patiently worked to rebuild the neurological pathways that connected thought to feeling to expression in ways that most people took for granted, but that had been deliberately severed through conditioning techniques that represented the darkest application of legitimate psychological research. Ace had become something of a celebrity among the medical staff and patients, his gentle presence providing a form of therapy that no human intervention could replicate, as the children seemed to respond to his calm energy and unconditional acceptance in ways that allowed them to begin trusting again, despite the systematic betrayal they had experienced at the hands of adults who were supposed to protect them. The German Shepherd's natural ability to sense emotional distress and provide comfort had been enhanced through specialized training programs developed specifically for working with trafficking victims, and Jason watched with pride as his partner helped facilitate breakthroughs that traditional therapy might have taken months or years to achieve through conventional methods alone. The other heroes in this story included the federal agents who had worked 18-hour days for months to track down every lead and identify every facility connected to the network, the forensic specialists who had painstakingly analyzed evidence that revealed the full scope of the operation, and the medical professionals who had volunteered their time and expertise to develop treatment approaches that had never been attempted before in cases involving this level of systematic psychological manipulation. Agent Torres had been promoted and transferred to a new unit, specifically created to investigate trafficking networks that incorporated research and experimental components, recognizing that the case they had worked together represented an evolution in criminal activity that required new investigative approaches and specialized expertise to identify and dismantle operations that combined traditional trafficking with cutting-edge research into human behavioral modification. The prosecutorial team that had secured convictions against Dr. Julian and his associates had established legal precedents that would make it easier for future cases to address the hybrid nature of trafficking operations that included research components, creating new categories of charges that specifically addressed the use of trafficking victims as experimental subjects in unauthorized research programs that violated both trafficking laws and medical ethics regulations. Jason continued to work with ACE on follow-up investigations that had emerged from the intelligence gathered during the original case, as the network they had dismantled had connections to similar operations in other countries that were now being investigated by international law enforcement agencies, coordinating their efforts through Interpol and other multinational organizations dedicated to combating crimes against children. The bond between Jason and Ace had been strengthened by their shared experience of confronting evil in its most sophisticated and systematic form, and their partnership had become a model for other K9 units being trained, specifically to work on trafficking cases that required the unique combination of investigative skills and emotional resilience that both human and canine officers needed to navigate the psychological challenges of cases involving extreme abuse and systematic dehumanization. The community response had been overwhelming, with donations and volunteer support flowing in to help fund the specialized therapy programs and long-term care that the rescued children would need as they slowly rebuilt their lives and learned to navigate a world where they could finally experience safety, dignity, and the possibility of healing from trauma that had once seemed irreversible. 2 years have passed since that October night, when a delivery driver's emergency call led Officer Jason Reed and his partner Ace into the depths of the abandoned Griggs doll factory, and the reverberations from what they discovered there continue to reshape how law enforcement agencies across the country approach investigations involving crimes against children and the evolving sophistication of criminal networks that exploit advances in psychology and technology to perfect their methods of victimization. Jason still patrols the streets of Cascade County, but his work has expanded to include consultation with federal task forces investigating similar cases in other jurisdictions, as the expertise he and Ace developed during their investigation has become a valuable resource for agencies confronting trafficking. Operations that incorporate research and experimental components designed to maximize the psychological control over victims while generating multiple revenue streams from both traditional clients and research organizations. The children they rescued have made remarkable progress in their recovery, though Dr. Chen continues to emphasize that healing from this level of systematic abuse is a process that will continue for years and may never completely restore all the cognitive and emotional functions that were damaged during their captivity, serving as a permanent reminder of the long-term consequences of crimes that treat human beings as experimental subjects rather than individuals deserving of protection and dignity. Ace remains Jason's constant companion, his natural abilities enhanced by specialized training that has made him one of the most effective K9 officers in the country for detecting signs of trafficking operations and providing therapeutic support to victims who respond to his presence in ways that traditional therapy cannot replicate. The legal precedents established through the prosecutions arising from this case have created new frameworks for addressing trafficking operations that incorporate research components, but legal experts warn that criminal organizations are constantly evolving their methods and that the techniques developed by Dr. Julian's network represent only the beginning of what may become a new category of crimes that combine traditional trafficking with cutting-edge research into human behavioral modification and psychological control. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that the network they dismantled was not unique, as similar operations have been identified in other countries where legal and ethical oversight of research activities is less rigorous, suggesting that the systematic exploitation of trafficking victims for experimental purposes may be more widespread than anyone previously imagined. The international cooperation that emerged from this investigation has led to new protocols for sharing intelligence about trafficking networks that cross national borders, but the sophisticated methods used by these organizations to hide their activities and protect their operations, continue to challenge traditional law enforcement approaches that were developed to address conventional criminal enterprises rather than hybrid organizations that combine trafficking with legitimate-seeming research activities. Jason often reflects on the randomness of the events that led to their discovery of the network, wondering how many similar operations continue to operate undetected because they have not yet made the small mistakes or encountered the chance circumstances that brought this one to light. And he remains haunted by the possibility that somewhere in the darkness, other children are suffering in facilities designed to strip away their humanity while generating data and revenue for individuals who view human beings as research subjects and commercial products. The partnership between Jason and Ace has become a symbol of hope for the law enforcement community and the families of trafficking victims, demonstrating that justice is possible even in cases involving the most sophisticated and systematic forms of abuse. But both man and dog carry the weight of knowing that their victory, however significant, represents only a small step in an ongoing battle against forms of evil that continue to evolve and adapt to evade detection by authorities who are still learning to recognize and combat crimes that challenge every assumption about the limits of human cruelty and the capabilities of modern criminal organizations. In the quiet moments between calls, Jason sometimes looks at Ace and wonders what other secrets remain hidden in the abandoned buildings and forgotten corners of their community, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, evil continues to operate with the patience and sophistication of those who understand that the greatest crimes are often those that remain invisible to the outside world, until someone with the courage and determination to look beyond the surface finally shines a light into places where humanity's darkest impulses have taken root and flourished under the protection of silence and society's reluctance to acknowledge that such horrors are not only possible, but actively occurring in the world we thought we knew. And you, what did you think about this story? Tell us in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next videos.